This morning, you got dressed. You probably didn't think about it for more than a few seconds. You opened a drawer, pulled something out, and put it on. It felt like the most ordinary thing a person can do. It felt like part of being human. And it is. But not for the reason you think. Because here is what almost nobody tells you. Anatomically modern humans, people with the same bodies, the same brains, the same hands you have right now, existed for roughly 200,000 years before there is any solid evidence they wore a single piece of clothing. 200,000 years of human beings walking the earth, building fires, burying their dead, painting on rocks, raising children, and not one of them put anything on in the morning. The real reason clothing started is not warmth. It is not modesty. It is not even survival in the way we usually mean the word. And when you understand what it actually was, the thing you did without thinking this morning looks like something else entirely. To understand clothing, you first have to understand the problem it was supposed to solve. And that problem is not the one most people assume. Humans are nearly hairless. Compared to every other great ape on the planet, we are almost naked. A chimpanzee, a gorilla, an orangutan, all of them are covered in thick protective fur. We are not. And this is strange, because we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees, and that ancestor almost certainly had fur. At some point in our evolutionary history, we lost it. Geneticists have traced this back to somewhere between 1.2 and 1.7 million years ago. That is long before clothing, long before fire was reliably controlled, and long before humans had spread into the cold climates of Europe and Asia. The hair loss happened in Africa, where it was warm. The leading explanation for why we lost our hair is called the thermoregulation hypothesis. As early humans began hunting and scavenging across open savanna during the hottest parts of the day, overheating became a serious problem. Fur traps heat. Losing the fur allowed our bodies to sweat more efficiently across a larger surface area, which allowed us to run longer distances without our brains cooking inside our skulls. We became persistence hunters. We could not outrun a deer or a wildebeest in a short sprint, but we could follow one for hours in the midday heat until it collapsed from exhaustion. The hairlessness was the weapon. But losing your fur in Africa creates a different problem. At night, even in equatorial Africa, temperatures drop significantly. A body that is built to shed heat efficiently during the day becomes dangerously cold after dark. And when our ancestors began moving north into the seasonal climates of the Middle East, Central Asia, and eventually Europe, the problem became extreme. Ice Age winters in Europe could reach temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in hours. So the obvious answer writes itself. Humans got cold. Humans wrapped themselves in animal skins. Problem solved. Except the evidence does not support that story. Not cleanly. And what the evidence actually shows is considerably stranger. The most precise evidence we have for when clothing began does not come from fabric. Fabric decays. It does not come from bone needles, though those matter too. It comes from lice, specifically from the genetic difference between two kinds of lice that live on your body right now, or would if you let them. Head lice and body lice are closely related but distinct species. Head lice live in your hair. Body lice live in clothing. They need the fibers of a garment to lay their eggs. They cannot survive on a naked human body. They require clothing to exist. This means that body lice could not have evolved until humans started wearing clothes regularly. The moment our ancestors started dressing consistently enough to give lice a permanent habitat, a new species began to diverge from the original head louse population. In 2003, a team of researchers at the Max Planck Institute ran the DNA of body lice through a molecular clock analysis, calculating backward from the known mutation rate to find when the two species split. Their answer was approximately 107,000 years ago. A later study pushed the estimate to somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago, depending on the mutation rate used. Sit with that number for a moment. Body lice that need clothing to survive diverged from head lice somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. That is when clothing became a regular enough habit to sustain an entirely new parasite. That is your most honest timestamp for when humans started getting dressed. And here is where the story stops making simple sense. Those dates place the origin of clothing in Africa, not in an ice age, not in a frozen landscape where naked survival was impossible. In the same warm continent where our ancestors had been living for hundreds of thousands of years without any clothing at all. The climate in sub-Saharan Africa 100,000 years ago was not cold enough to make clothing a physiological necessity. People were not wrapping themselves in skins because they were about to freeze to death. So why did they start? The oldest confirmed clothing-related artifacts are not the skins themselves, which have long since decayed, but the tools used to make them. Bone awls sharpened to pierce hide. Stone scrapers used to clean and soften animal skins. These tools appear in the archaeological record in Africa around 100,000 years ago, which lines up precisely with the lice evidence. But the most revealing artifact in the entire story is not a scraper or an awl. It is a needle. The bone needle, a thin sliver of bone with a small hole bored through one end to thread sinew or plant fiber, appears appears in the archaeological record approximately 50,000 years ago, and the needle changes everything about how we understand what our ancestors were doing with clothing. A needle is not a tool for making a blanket. You do not need a needle to wrap an animal skin around your shoulders for warmth. You need a needle to make fitted garments. Garments with sleeves, garments with seams. Garments that follow the shape of a body precisely. And in every culture where fitted, sewn clothing has been studied, the decoration of those garments appears almost simultaneously with the technique of making them. The people who invented the needle were not trying to stay warm. They were trying to make something that looked a specific way. Archaeological sites from this period show garments decorated with beads, ochre pigment, shells, and pierced animal teeth. At Sungir, a burial site in Russia dating to roughly 34,000 years ago, excavators found the remains of 2 children buried with more than 10,000 individually drilled mammoth ivory beads sewn into their clothing. The beads would have taken an estimated 10,000 hours of labor to produce. Nobody spends 10,000 hours decorating a child's burial clothes because they are worried about insulation. They spend 10,000 hours because the clothing is communicating something about the children, about their family, about who they were and who their people were. This is what the evidence points toward, and it is a conclusion that several anthropologists have now argued in detail. Clothing did not begin as a survival technology that later became cultural. It began as a cultural technology that also happened to keep people warm. We did not dress to survive, we dressed to be seen. This fits inside a broader pattern in human evolution that archaeologists call symbolic behavior. Around 100,000 years ago, something shifted in the way humans related to the world around them. They began using ochre pigment to mark their bodies and objects. They began making jewelry from shells collected far from where they lived. They began burying their dead with objects that had no practical use. They began doing things that had no survival function and could only be explained by a need to signal identity, status, group membership, and meaning. Clothing belongs to this same cluster of behaviors. It is not a blanket with ambitions. It is a signal that also happens to provide warmth. The warmth was a secondary benefit of a primary social drive. Anthropologist Ian Gilligan has spent years studying the relationship between climate and clothing, and his conclusion is nuanced. Thermal protection did become critical as humans moved into colder environments, particularly during the glacial periods of the last ice age. Fitted, sewn clothing was probably the single most important factor in allowing humans to survive European winters 40,000 years ago. Without it, the peopling of northern Eurasia would likely have been impossible, so warmth absolutely mattered. It just was not where clothing started. What started it was something older and stranger than the cold. It was the need to be recognized, the need to communicate who you are across a distance, before you speak, before you are close enough to be identified by your face. Every human group that has ever been studied, no matter how isolated, no matter how simple their material culture, decorates the body. It appears to be a universal, not a cultural invention that spread from one place. A drive that emerged independently in population after population because it was meeting a need so fundamental that the species could not function without it. The need to be legible to other humans. The need to say, before you open your mouth, here is who I am, here is where I come from, here is what group I belong to, here is my status within it. There is a word for this in the modern world. It is called fashion, and we treat it as shallow, as vanity, as the least serious of human preoccupations. But the archaeological record suggests it is one of the oldest, that the impulse driving a person to spend money on the right shoes, or the right jacket, or the right version of themselves to present to the world, is not a modern weakness. It is a 100,000-year-old behavior running exactly as designed. The clothes you wore this morning were not chosen for warmth, not primarily. They were chosen because of what they say, about your taste, your group, your status, your identity. The same calculation your ancestors were running in Africa 100,000 years ago, before agriculture, before cities, before writing, before almost everything we call civilization. You got dressed this morning for the same reason the first human who ever got dressed did it. Not because you were cold, because you needed other people to know who you are. That need is so old it has its own parasite, and the parasite is still with us.